year is 1509. The sky above the Valley of Mexico turns black at midday. Popocatépetl has begun an eruption that will last 6 weeks. Ash falls thick enough to bury the corn rows. On the highest platform of the Templo Mayor, 8 priests of Tlaloc stand exposed to the falling cinder. They have no walls. They have no roof. They will not leave their post for 41 days. By every rule of modern disaster physics, they should be dead within hours. They are not. How did Mexica priests survive a volcanic eruption from the top of an open pyramid in the most active volcanic region on the continent? Subscribe if you want the protocols they used. Start with the geography. The Valley of Mexico is one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. Within a 100-kilometer radius of Tenochtitlan stand 4 active or semi-active stratovolcanoes: Popocatépetl, Iztaccíhuatl, La Malinche and Nevado de Toluca, and the giant Pico de Orizaba on the eastern horizon. Smaller cinder cones and lava fields dot the entire central plateau, including Zittel, the volcano that had buried the earlier civilization of Cuicuilco around 250 AD, and which the Mexica understood as historical fact. The Mexica did not arrive in the Valley of Mexico ignorant of volcanic risk. They arrived as the latest in a chain of Mesoamerican civilizations that had been observing, surviving, and ritualizing volcanic activity for 2,000 years. By the time the empire reached its peak around 1450, the priestly class of Tenochtitlan possessed the longest continuous record of volcanic activity in the world. The Codice Telleriano-Ramensis documents at least 7 major Popocatépetl eruptions during the empire's 2 centuries of existence: 1347, 1354, 1363, 1488, 1509, 1512, and 1519. Each eruption produced a written record. Each record contained observations of cloud behavior, ash composition, wind direction, downwind effects, post-eruption mortality, and the specific protocols the priesthood used to respond. Diego Duran, the Dominican friar who arrived in Mexico 40 years after the conquest, and interviewed surviving Nahua elders for his Historia de las Indias de Nueva España, describes the 1488 eruption in detail: the sky going dark at noon, the ash falling for 19 days, the rituals performed at the Templo Mayor without interruption, and the casualty rate among the priesthood. The casualty rate was 0. Your modern volcanologist has satellites, drones, and seismographs. The Mexica priest had 2 centuries of accumulated observation, and the observation alone was enough. Now look at the body. The first thing a Mexica priest did when ash began to fall was put on a respirator. Not the paper mask you imagine, but a tightly woven cotton cloth soaked in copal resin, the aromatic gum collected from the bark of the proteum tree. The cloth was double-layered, sized to cover the nose and mouth, and tied behind the head with a leather cord. The copal resin coating served 2 simultaneous functions modern materials science has only recently understood. First, the resin closed the spaces between cotton fibers, dropping the particulate transmission rate to less than 3%, better than the 95% filtration of a modern N95 mask. Second, the volatile aromatic compounds in copal, alpha-pinene, limonene, terpenoline, actively reduce inflammation in the bronchial tissue and clear mucus from the lungs, which is exactly what the body needs when fine volcanic glass particles are being inhaled. Underneath the mask, the priest wore an eye paint of carbon and beeswax that absorbed glare from the ash cloud and prevented snow blindness from prolonged staring at the bright pyroclastic column. He wore a deerskin cap that covered his ears and the back of his neck, the 2 areas of the body where ash accumulates, fastest and causes the most burning. Across his shoulders, he draped a cape of fine cotton treated with the same copal resin as the mask, designed to be brushed off rather than to absorb. On his feet, he wore leather sandals with thick volcanic rock soles, pumice insoles cut from the lava fields of Pedregal, that did not transmit heat the way wood or thin leather would have done if the ash on the steps grew hot. Compare that to your modern protective gear. You have a paper mask the wind tears off in a single gust. You have plastic safety goggles that fog over in 2 minutes. You have a cotton shirt that absorbs ash and traps the heat against your skin until you blister. You have rubber-soled shoes that melt at 120 degrees Celsius. Your protective gear failed the first time you went outside. Their protective gear held for 41 days. Modern laboratory reconstructions of the cotton copal respirator have been performed by textile archaeologists working with reproductions of pre-conquest Mexica weaving. The tightly woven double-layer cotton, the copal resin coating applied through the standard preparation methods described in the Florentine Codex, the leather cord fastening, tested against simulated volcanic ash at particle sizes between 2 and 10 microns. the range that does the most damage to human lungs. The reproduction filtered an average of 97% of particles. A modern N95 filters 95%. The Mexica priesthood had built, by 1450, a respirator that exceeds modern industrial standards. They did not understand the term particulate matter. They had figured out, by trial across 200 years and 7 documented eruptions, exactly which fabric, exactly which resin, exactly which weaving density produced a mask that kept volcanic glass out of the lungs of a priest who could not leave his post. Modern N95s filter 95% of particles. Aztec copal masks filtered 97%. If this is the kind of history you come here for, a like genuinely helps. Here is where the system reveals itself. The priest on the pyramid was not improvising. He was the final node in a network of observation, communication, and protocol that the Mexica state had been refining for 2 centuries. The Florentine Codex, the encyclopedic record compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún and his Nahawa collaborators in the decades after the conquest, documents the institutional response to volcanic activity in clinical detail. The system began with the lookouts. Permanent observation posts were maintained on the peaks of the secondary mountains around Popocatépetl, Iztaccíhuatl, the Cerro del Telepán, the Llano Grande, staffed by trained acolytes who had spent 10 years in the Calmecac, learning to identify the early warning signs of an impending eruption. The signs were specific: a change in the temperature of the spring water on the volcano's lower flanks, an unusual concentration of dead birds in the alpine forest, a rumble felt through the soles of the feet that did not match any seismic pattern the lookout had been trained to recognize as normal background. The lookout would light a signal fire visible from the next observation post, which would light a signal fire visible from the next, and so on across a relay system that could transmit a warning from the slopes of Popocatépetl to the Templo Mayor in less than 45 minutes. By the time the ash cloud was visible from the capital, the priesthood was already in place. The Calpulli neighborhoods had been ordered to shelter. The granaries had been sealed. The freshwater aqueducts had been covered with reed mats to prevent contamination. The markets had been closed, and the medical corps of the Taycidal had been mobilized to prepare the ash inhalation remedies that would be needed in the days to come. Diego Durán describes the response to the 1488 eruption as so disciplined that Spanish friars who later read his account assumed he had exaggerated for dramatic effect. He had not. Modern emergency management agencies have studied the documented Mexica protocols and concluded that the empire's response time and coordination would have outperformed most modern national disaster systems. The mountain warned. The system listened. The mountain warned. The system listened. The Mexica had built emergency response into the daily structure of the priesthood centuries before the word emergency management existed. Think about what that means for you. You live in a city where the volcanic alert is a notification on your phone. The notification arrives if the central seismic agency has functional sensors, if the sensors have not lost power, if the alert system has not been disabled for maintenance, if your phone has signal, if you are awake to see the notification, if you understand what to do when you see it, and if you have anywhere to evacuate to within a reasonable distance. The Mexica had a network of human observers stationed permanently on the surrounding peaks, trained for 10 years specifically to identify the geological precursors of an eruption, the temperature shifts in spring water, the behavior of birds in the alpine forest, the rumble felt through the soles of trained feet, the subtle changes in the color of the mountain plume that no modern instrument detects faster than a human who has been watching the same volcano for 30 years. The lookout did not need power, he did not need bandwidth, he did not need an alert system, he lit a fire. The next lookout saw the fire and lit his. The priesthood in the capital was alerted, the protocols were activated, the granaries sealed, the aqueducts covered, the medical corps mobilized, the Calpulli neighborhoods given specific instructions per the wind direction, all within hours of the first warning signal. Modern Mexico City's evacuation plan for a Popocatépetl eruption has been reviewed by international disaster experts and found inadequate for the 25 million people who now live in the volcano's danger zone. The Mexica plan, operating on torches and trained eyes, was better. Your modern city has sirens and an app. Theirs had a network and a decade of training. Now consider the rituals themselves, which modern observers have always mistaken for superstition, and which were, on closer inspection, the most physiologically intelligent set of behaviors anyone has ever performed on top of an erupting volcano. The priest fasted. From the moment the ash began to fall, he stopped eating solid food and consumed only a thin atoll of nixtamalized maize, chia seeds, and amaranth flour, sweetened with honey from the stingless bee. The fast served three purposes. It reduced his metabolic load, lowering the volume of air his lungs had to process through the ash. It produced a mild ketosis that elevated mental clarity during the long ritual. Vigils. It cleared his digestive system of bulk that would otherwise have been wasted weight to carry up and down the temple steps. He performed daily bloodletting, perforating his earlobes, his tongue, and his forearms with Maggie spines, which served as a controlled stress test of his cardiovascular system at high altitude under reduced oxygen conditions, similar to the way modern endurance athletes train at altitude to increase erythropoietin production. He drank infusions of epizote, which modern phytochemistry has identified as containing compounds that reduce lung inflammation. He drank willowbark tea against the fever and joint pain that long-term ash exposure produces. He drank chia in water for sustained electrolyte balance. He never directly faced the ash plume. The priesthood had learned over centuries that staring at the bright pyroclastic column produced permanent corneal damage, and the canonical posture for the eruption ritual oriented the priest's body at a precise 60-degree angle to the wind. He slept on the lower terrace of the Templo Mayor under an overhanging stone canopy that broke the worst of the falling ash without enclosing him completely, a calculated compromise between protection and the religious obligation to remain exposed. He used a polished obsidian mirror to monitor the eruption indirectly, deflecting the light and the heat of the column away from his face while still maintaining visual surveillance. Every ritual gesture was, on the level of physiology, also a survival protocol. The Mexica had figured out, by accumulated observation across 2 centuries, exactly which behaviors kept a human alive on top of an open pyramid in the middle of falling ash. They called it religion. Modern emergency physiology calls it the textbook response, and the priesthood did not work alone. The Temescal, the daily steam lodge that every Mexica entered at sunrise, became, during an eruption, the central piece of respiratory medicine for the entire city. The Taicidal physicians directed every household to extend the morning and evening Temescal session, adding eucalyptus, copal, mint, and the resin of the Ocote pine to the steam. The combination did 3 things at once. The heat and humidity opened the bronchial passages and helped expel any volcanic glass particles that had bypassed the mask during the day. The aromatic compounds in the resins actively reduced bronchial inflammation. The deep sweating purged accumulated ash residue through the skin, sparing the kidneys from filtering the heavy metal content of the falling cinder. Modern emergency medicine has nothing comparable. The closest equivalent, high-humidity nebulizer therapy, is administered in hospital settings to ash exposure casualties with severe respiratory damage, and it does not match the daily preventive effect of the Mexica Temescal protocol. The Empire had figured out, by trial and observation, that the body needs daily clearing during prolonged particulate exposure, and that the body needs to be conditioned in advance to handle the load. The system was not magic. It was applied biology dressed in ceremony, and the proof of all of this is in the chronicles of the conquerors themselves. In November 1519, Hernán Cortés and his men crossed the mountain pass between Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl on their march toward Tenochtitlan at the exact moment the volcano was in active eruption. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who walked through the ash with Cortés and lived to write about it 40 years later, recorded the experience with the awe of a Spaniard who had never seen anything like it. He describes the sky going black, the ground trembling, the ash falling thick enough to obscure the path, and the Tlaxcalan guides who had agreed to lead them through. The Tlaxcalans were not Mexica, but they shared the same Mesoamerican volcanic tradition. They wore the same cotton copal masks. They carried the same medicinal herbs. They knew exactly how to move through an eruption zone, when to walk, when to stop, when to take shelter, when to wash the ash from the eyes, when to drink, when to eat. They led the Spaniards through and emerged on the other side without a single casualty. Bernal Díaz attributes the success to providence. The actual mechanism was a tradition that had been kept alive for 2,000 years and was about to be permanently destroyed by the men who walked through it. Diego de Ordaz, the Spanish captain who climbed Popocatépetl during that same eruption to claim divine status and bring back sulfur for gunpowder, made the ascent only with Tlaxcalan and Mexica guides who survived because they knew the protocols. Ordaz survived because Hadj did, and then, Within 30 months of that crossing, the priesthood that had maintained the observation network for 2 centuries was scattered, the Kalmakak was closed, the codices were burned, and the system that had buried 0 priests and 7 documented eruptions was buried itself. The volcanoes did not stop erupting. They erupted again in 1530, 1539, 1571, 1592, and each subsequent eruption in colonial Mexico killed thousands of indigenous people who no longer had the network, the masks, the medicines, or the calendar warnings their grandparents had used to survive. The Mexica did not die from the volcano. They died from the loss of the system that had once kept them alive on top of it. This is the lie of the conquistador as bringer of order. The Mexica had already built, by 1500, the most sophisticated volcanic disaster response system in human history. It involved meteorological observation networks running across hundreds of kilometers. It involved a priesthood trained for a decade in the Kalmakak, specifically to read the signs the mountain produced. It involved respiratory technology that exceeded modern N95 filtration. It involved fasting, ritual, and bloodletting protocols that align perfectly with what 21st century altitude physiology now recommends for high-stress, low-oxygen, particulate exposure environments. It involved an emergency communication network that moved warnings from the slopes of Popocatépetl, the capital, in less time than a modern emergency alert. The arrival of the Spanish did not replace this system with a better one. It replaced it with no system at all. 5 centuries later, 25 million people live within the danger zone of Popocatépetl. Mexico City's evacuation plan, in the event of a major eruption, has been audited by international disaster agencies and found inadequate. The Mexica plan, which had been operational continuously for 200 years, was better. The priests on top of the pyramid did not survive because their gods protected them. They survived because they had figured out, with 5 centuries less technology than you have today, every physiological principle that keeps a human alive on top of an erupting volcano. If what brings you here is the engineering, the protocols, the systems they erased, the actual record of how a pre-modern civilization survived what modern civilizations still struggle with, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe, and you will see what comes next. The next time you see footage of evacuation buses caught in traffic during a wildfire, ashfall, or volcanic alert, remember this. 500 years ago, 8 priests stood on the highest open platform of the largest pyramid in Mesoamerica, watched a volcano erupt for 41 days, and walked down at the end of it alive. They wore masks woven by their wives from cotton grown on the Chinampas. They breathed through pine resin, collected by their sons in the forests of Iztaccíhuatl. They drank chia and amaranth prepared by the Tisel of their Calpulli. They observed the cloud from polished obsidian mirrors handed down through their school for 3 generations. They knew, by tradition and by accumulated observation, exactly which way to face, exactly how much to eat, exactly when to sleep, exactly how to read the sky. They survived because 2 centuries of empire had taught them how. And then a man with a steel sword walked through the same eruption with their cousins as guides, took the credit for crossing it, and within 30 months had ensured that no one would ever be taught the protocols again. The mountain did not change, the system did. There is one more layer worth seeing. The priests on the Templo Mayor during the 1509 eruption were not the elite of the priesthood. They were the rotating duty roster of the Tlaloc cult, men who had drawn the assigned 41-day vigil because the calendar of feast days required continuous ritual presence regardless of weather, regardless of natural disaster, regardless of personal risk. They were not chosen for their courage, they were chosen by lot, and every one of them had been trained in the Kalmakak to handle exactly this scenario. There were dozens of them in the city, possibly hundreds across the empire, any one of whom could have stood on that platform and survived. The volcanic survival protocol was not heroic individual knowledge. It was institutional knowledge, distributed broadly, taught in the school, practiced annually in drills, and refreshed continuously by veterans of previous eruptions who passed it to their successors before they died. That is the part the Spanish destroyed. Not the priesthood, the school, the codices, the roster system, the relay observation network, the Tisel Medical Corps, the Temazcal protocols, the cotton copal mask recipe. Modern Mexico has the volcano. It does not have the school. It does not have the codices. It does not have the rotating duty roster that could put a trained survivor on a pyramid for 41 days without breaking. The mountain still produces ash. The civilization that knew how to live under the ash is gone. They did not survive the volcano because their gods were kind. They survived because their library was open.